You know the golden rule, right?
I think so. It's whoever has the gold makes the rules, right?
That's it. Yeah. There are no free lunches. Let's do this. The press reported that the witnesses claim that I helped to obtain key posts for persons I knew were engaged in espionage work to help them in that work. That allegation is unqualifiedly false. The principles in which I believe and by which I live make it impossible for me to ever do a disloyal act or anything against the interests of our country. My creed is the American creed. I believe in freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of the press, freedom of criticism, and freedom of movement. I believe in the goal of equality of opportunity. I believe in the right and duty of every citizen to work for, to expect, and to obtain an increasing measure of political, economic, and emotional security for all. I am opposed to discrimination in any form. I believe in the freedom of choice of one's representatives in government, untrammeled by machine guns, secret police, or a police state. I am opposed to arbitrary and unwarranted use of power or authority from whatever source or against any individual or group. I believe in a government of law, not of men, where law is above any man, and not any man above the law. I consider these principles sacred. I regard them as the basic fabric of our American way of life, and I believe in them as living realities and not as mere words on paper. That is my creed. I am ready for any questions you may wish to ask. That, Matt, is how Harry Dexter White, Assistant Treasury Secretary under FDR and architect of the Bretton Woods system, opened when he appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1948, facing allegations of espionage. Bit of a tragic hero.
This guy set up the global monetary system for the following almost 20 years, and turns out he was a Russian spy.
A Russian spy.
Wild.
Yeah, I mean, in this series, we're going to dive into the Nixon shock, obviously, which is the announcement that ended the Bretton Woods system that we're gonna talk about today. You can't talk about the Nixon shock unless you talk about Bretton Woods, and I don't think you can talk about Bretton Woods. There wouldn't be a Bretton Woods, at least not the way that we know it, without Harry Dexter White, right? I think the Bretton Woods story kind of has it all, right? It has gold and power and war and politics and spies. I think at its core, it's really a story about this ambitious guy, Harry Dexter White, who takes on this aristocratic, kind of world-famous British economist, John Maynard Keynes, and he wins. Harry Dexter White wins, only to set up a system that kind of becomes the thorn in the side of all the presidents from, Kennedy through Nixon. And by the way, side note, do you know who was in that room when White delivered that opening to his testimony?
Who?
You know this. It's Nixon. Nixon was in the room.
He's in the room?
He's in the room. He's actually on the committee. He's a freshman Republican from California at that point. He's in like his first year in Congress. So Nixon, full circle, was actually in the room when White has to testify in 1948.
One of the crazy things about Henry Dexter White, right, is that I think the FBI was keeping a file on him from like 1941, 1942 timeframe. So some people knew.
Harry Dexter White, here's a guy that he was born in 1892. He's in Boston, youngest of 7 kids. He's born 4 months after his dad becomes a U.S. citizen, actually. His dad's from Lithuania, a Jewish immigrant. And he's kind of bullied as a kid. I think Ben Steele, in his great book, The Battle of Bretton Woods, describes him as shy but witty. And then tragically, his mom passed away when he was 9 years old. And then his dad passes away when he's 16. So right off the bat, pretty tough life growing up, a lot of adversity, and he's a bit of an outsider. So for about 5 years after all of that, he manages his family business, which is, they own a couple of hardware stores in the Boston area. He enrolls at what is now the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, but he drops out. And then in 1917, when the U.S. enters World War I, he enlists in the U.S. Army, goes to officer training, deploys to France, doesn't see any combat. He comes back to the U.S. in 1918. He's kind of unsatisfied with his small business life. So he moves to New York. He gets married. He's kind of fretting over kind of making something out of himself. He's really dissatisfied. So he enrolls at Columbia in 1922, and he wants to study government. He decides he wants to actually move to California, so he transfers to Stanford. He graduates with great distinction in economics, gets a master, and then moves back to Boston to get his PhD at Harvard. And at his core, and I think, tell me if you disagree, I think at a high level, I sort of agree with this. At his core, he believes that all government problems are economic problems, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think his entire education would support that as a conclusion.
Yeah. And so he publishes his dissertation at Harvard in 1932, and he's 40 years old at this point. His dissertation is about French international accounts in 1880 through
Exciting.
1913. Yeah, which is, as all dissertations are, very, very detailed topic.
But he was 40 at that time?
He was 40 years old when he gets his PhD. Guy? Yeah, he's older. And what's interesting about his dissertation is that it's actually all about the relationship of the international monetary system and the real economy. And, you can only connect the dots looking backward, and we'll see this kind of play out throughout the story, but he's already developing into kind of the perfect person to architect a global monetary system, right? I think one thing that's interesting to me about this period too is that you got to put it into context, right? Like, so the whole economics discipline at this time is pretty obsessed with maybe two things. One, the pre-World War I period, which was this sort of golden era of productivity and economic growth across the world. Also, the gold standard was the predominant monetary system at that point. But also, everybody's pretty obsessed, particularly with the chaos that came after World War I. And of course, with the Great Depression that is like in full swing, during this period. And to kind of put some statistics around it, trade was down 2/3. And most of that is from competitive tariffs and trade wars and currency wars and all these things that are happening at the time as everybody's trying to recover from World War I and in like really strong nationalistic competition. But also domestically, U.S. GDP was down by 1/3 and U.S. unemployment peaked at like 25%, which is an insane level. I think today we're at like 4% plus or minus.
Right. And I think what you're pointing out here is, I think, one of the main things on people's minds as they headed into Bretton Woods, right, was the Great Depression lasted almost the entire 30s. I think it's normally associated with kind of the early 30s, but there was another major downdraft in the late 30s, and people were terrified as World War II ended that the economy was just going to go right off a cliff again.
Yeah.
And so a lot of Bretton Woods, I agree, was about preventing that from happening, while also having an eye on the, how the end of World War I was kind of mishandled by the fact that World War II happened. And I think one of the main things people were focused on was that the U.S. was not a part of the solution after World War I, right? Like we didn't join the League of Nations,
right? And
we didn't help with Reconstruction. And so to me, those were the two major things on people's minds. One was, let's not slide off into depression again, and two is we need the U.S. even more so than after World War I.
Yep. Economics people, in particular policymakers, are kind of traumatized by all of that. And White, I think in particular, he's on the one hand, he's very desperate to kind of make his mark, right? And to kind of make the world better. He's a very kind of optimistic, idealistic kind of guy. But, he's at Harvard and he's kind of teaching. He's not the most liked person there. And there's no room for him in terms of like the tenure track or an actual professorship. And he gets pretty frustrated. He ends up moving to a place called Lawrence College in Wisconsin in 1932.
Great school.
Yeah. And as you can imagine, for somebody who's very ambitious and who craves relevance, this is not where he wants to be. And he's pretty miserable. He's very frustrated. He's considered this kind of abrasive, opinionated guy. I thought the worst insult that I read about him during this time period is that his academic colleagues considered his economics basic, which is kind of a fun thing to think about. Yeah, that's an insult. And so as he's starting to kind of lose hope and despair, first he has an idea. He says, I think central planning is the future. I think economists with data, thinking about how to optimize the economy, I think that's where we're going. And guess who's doing that? It's the Soviet Union. So I'm going to move to Russia and I'm going to study central planning. And it's going to be great. I'm going to learn so much. Lucky for him, I guess, in hindsight, he was actually very in tune with the political sort of trends and he leaned progressive. FDR as president. And so in 1934, he actually gets a call from a professor at the University of Chicago, Jacob Beiner, who was actually Milton Friedman's professor. He gets a call and an invitation to come to Washington to assist in a study to basically help the Treasury organize economic policy, basically organize the economic policy agenda for the FDR White House. Harry White
How old is he at this point? Is he like kind of late 40s now?
Yeah, he's in early 40s. And he doesn't think twice, right? Like he's like, this is what I've been waiting for. He doesn't even ask the terms of the offer. Like within 2 days, he just accepts and he moves the family to DC and he goes off to Washington. And he kind of throws himself at this problem of like trying to figure out what is going to be this agenda for the White House. How do we like architect a new system? And he writes a memo. One of the first things he did, he writes this memo called The Selection of a Monetary Standard for the U.S., in which he outlines his vision that kind of tells you exactly what he's thinking at the time. So he basically says the problem right now for the world is there's too intense economic nationalism. And the goal for all of us should be a global, kind of stable, peaceful economy that is growing. The means by which we do that is basically free trade, right? More and freer trade. And the solution is a monetary standard that promotes growth, but that allows for sovereignty in domestic policies. Basically, he says, we want a system that greases the wheels of commerce for the world, but that doesn't constrain a government from doing what's right internally, like for their own economies. So as an aside, I think we should talk a little bit about trade, which is like really technical and abstract, but I think we can actually paint a picture that is very understandable. I think it's what I had to do to really understand this stuff. And so let's paint a picture let's pretend two countries. Let's pretend that France is exporting wine to Canada. Canada is exporting maple syrup to France. Okay. And you can barter. You can do what's called a bilateral trade agreement and basically agree with each other. It's like, hey, I'm France. I'm going to send you $100 worth of wine. You, Canada, are going to send me $100 worth of maple syrup. And that's it. That's all we're going to trade. It's going to be balanced. There's no sense of like a surplus or a deficit of trade. We don't need to pay each other for anything because we're exchanging goods that are equal in value. That's like basically like a barter agreement. However, if you actually have free trade, you would have a situation where the Canadian market would absorb as much wine as they want, and the French would absorb as much maple syrup as they want, and you make up the difference with money, right? Like whatever you don't actually trade in terms of goods, you just make up the difference in money. Under the gold standard, what would happen is that gold would flow out to pay for this. So let's say that France is sending more wine to Canada than Canada is sending maple syrup. Let's say it's, there's $100 worth of wine coming into Canada, but only $50 worth of maple syrup going to France. The Canadians would basically send $50 worth of gold. Simplistically, but that's basically what would happen. And as the Canadians were losing gold from their reserves, basically, because the money supply was backed by gold, there would be less money, which meant less credit, which meant higher interest rates, which meant that businesses would slow down, prices would decline, you would get deflation, higher unemployment because businesses don't need as many people if there's less demand. And it would lead to this really damaging situation where, the value of the debt is going up. And so anybody who's a debtor is freaking out because this is terrible. The value of the debt that you owe is more expensive. People are delaying purchases, right? Because if I don't need to buy something today, if I can delay it a week or a month and I know the price is going to go down, I'm probably going to do that. And so as this kind of seeps into the psychology, it can lead to a spiral that actually kind of happened during the Great Depression, and it can be a disaster. And so getting back to the concept of exchange rate stability and trade and how Harry White and others are thinking about this, basically when Harry White's job ends, his temporary assignment at the Treasury, he really wants to stay in Washington, and he takes another temporary assignment in the Division of Statistics and Research. And he's kind of the right guy at the right time at the perfect place because he's super ambitious. He understands all these things, and all these sort of international economics topics are becoming the central thing, as the FDR White House is navigating World War II, and as Henry Morgenthau in particular is thinking about what comes after. And so Henry Morgenthau also, by the way, was not a technocratic economist. Like he was not this highly sophisticated economist. He was a close friend of the FDR, but he's constantly having to fight this turf wars with the State Department. And so he needs somebody who's very technically savvy that can be kind of his right-hand man to win those turf wars and get his way. That's kind of the way, administrations work. And so Morgenthau actually ends up leaning on White pretty heavily, and he sends him on a diplomatic trip to Europe in 1935. It's all about kind of monetary diplomacy. That's what the goal of the trip is, where he meets the famous British economist, John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes, to paint a little bit of a picture on him, Keynes was born to an upper middle class family. He's this kind of aristocratic guy who shows flashes of brilliance even as a kid, so very sharp. His dad was a Cambridge professor for like 4 decades, and his mom also went to Cambridge, and I think she was the first mayor of Cambridge. And
kind
the family,
the opposite of Henry Dexter White, right?
The complete opposite. The complete opposite, exactly. They have cooks and maids, and he has a governess growing up. I wish I had that for my kids. It'd be a lot easier.
You could one day. You could make it. This podcast.
Yeah, we'll get there. But he's all very high class, right? And he's this brilliant guy. He actually he gets this thing called a lifetime fellowship at Cambridge when he's 26, which is kind of just short of, it's not quite tenure, but basically he has like a lifetime appointment already at 26 at Cambridge. Goes off to India, comes back to Cambridge, and becomes the editor of this prominent economics journal. And then he starts publishing. And he's actually he's in Paris at Versailles when they're negotiating the Treaty of Versailles to negotiate the peace for World War I. And he kind of leaves in disgust because he sees the writing on the wall that the things that are being negotiated are going to end up in chaos. And so he actually ends up writing his first big famous piece, which is the economic consequences of the peace, criticizing the Treaty of Versailles, and in particular, kind of the leaders of each country that was forcing German reparations. And this book catapults him into world fame. So he's this world famous guy. He's actually very witty. And I don't know if you've read his stuff, but he's a very entertaining, right? I think he'd be great at social media today. He would definitely be on X.
The two things that stood out about Keynes and just who he is as a guy, right, is that for someone to get to where he was in terms of academic credibility, the idea that he didn't go through academia is totally unheard of.
Yeah.
And some stuff I read compared him to Einstein, and what their real strength was in analogy, right? They were really good at analogistic thinking.
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. They were both very creative and great at communication. And I think that that matters a lot when you're operating well beyond the edge of what, standard theory is. So fast forward to 1936, kind of building on that, he publishes maybe the most influential economic theory of all time, the general theory of employment, interest, and money. And so by the time that Keynes and White are meeting in London, Keynes is already a legend, right? And there's not a lot of documentation about this meeting. It sounds from what little there is that they're pretty aligned in economic policy. I mean, White is a Keynesian, right? He's a trained economist, and at this time, he's a Keynesian in the sense that he believes in actively managed economies and deficit spending and kind of using fiscal and monetary policy to stimulate the economy as necessary. They both dislike the gold standard. They're all very aligned, except for maybe one thing. On the one hand, Keynes is very much a British, center of the world. Imperialism is the answer, and the pound sterling, British money, should be this kind of unit of exchange for the world. Versus, of course, White is thinking, hey, America is now at the center of global output. Like the economy of the U.S. is the most powerful economy in the world, and so of course. That is the one point of disagreement at this point between both of them. I would say too that the picture that comes across from everything I read is that while they're both very ambitious, White comes across as this very kind of scrappy, person that knows how to navigate social and political situations. Keynes comes across as very arrogant and abrasive, brilliant, but arrogant and abrasive.
It seemed like Keynes had never been mistreated before, right? Like all of his interactions with the U.S., he kind of came away being like, these guys love us. They're going to take care of us. They're not gonna take our spot in the world. When that was very much White's aspiration from the very beginning, was to take global leadership. And
this is really where I think Harry White starts to become a central figure on the world stage. So there's several events, I think, that move White from the periphery into the center of the story here. And so, Morgenthau is not a Keynesian. He believes in balanced budgets. He's pretty conservative fiscally. But FDR is actually moving pretty significantly towards deficits as a way to stimulate the economy and get out of the Great Depression. Notably, White participates in a couple of key deals. So he negotiates a silver deal with the Chinese. He negotiates this thing called the Tripartite Agreement with France and Britain that had to do with competitive devaluations and trying to stop those. And then he famously wrote a memo in 1938 about Germany, Japan, and Italy and how aggressive they were being and how that was impacting U.S. trade and the dollar in particular. And so White and the Treasury in general are becoming really loud voices, pushing FDR to start taking action in Europe when Britain, France, and the Department of State, this is the late 30s, right? So technically we're not quite to the point where there's war in Europe. The State Department and Britain and France are playing the appeasement game at this point still. Whereas Treasury and Harry Dexter White are like, we need to be more aggressive. And as an aside, fast forward a couple of years, Harry White actually writes a memo, and it's hard to tell exactly how influential this was. There's, I think, a lot of disagreement on this in the academic literature, but he writes a memo that influences what's called the 10-point note, which is the ultimatum that the U.S. sends to Japan when they're trying to negotiate a truce in November 1941. And Harry Dexter White takes this incredibly aggressive stance that ends up influencing what goes to the Japanese. And the Japanese see it as an ultimatum that shuts the door for truce. And of course, basically a couple of weeks later, they bomb Pearl Harbor. And now the U.S. is kind of fully into the war.
The idea being that potentially the whole idea was that if the U.S. gets drawn into a Pacific war against Japan, then Japan can't counter Russia in any kind of way. Right. So Russia has kind of freedom on those borders.
Okay.
Right.
So back to the story. So the point is, Treasury is basically the economic arm of U.S. foreign policy. Harry White has been thinking about this idea of an international monetary conference for a while now. In fact, I think he mentions it in 1936 in a memo. He says something like, I think the quote is, "The more sterling countries there are, the stronger will be England's position around a conference table with the gold countries should an international conference take place." Right? So like he's clearly thinking about this stuff. And I think what's notable about all of this is that he clearly thinks of Britain, and I think this is true in general at that time in the US, he thinks of Britain as the key US competitor. Right? It is not the Soviets, it's not other countries, Britain is kind of the key US competitor that the US is trying to not just supplant, but really live up to. Right? And they see the British pound sterling as the key rival to the US dollar. Right? This concept, this theme of an ascending power versus a waning power is starting to play out at the time.
And the Federal Reserve was not independent at this point, right? The Federal Reserve was basically a part of the Treasury. It got kind of assumed into the Treasury to help finance the war.
Yeah, I don't think not institutionally, but operationally, yes. Right? Like the Fed is effectively working hand in hand with the Treasury and financing war debt. And there's no consideration for what we would consider today the dual mandate of inflation and employment. The Fed is really there to just print money and finance the war for the U.S. at this time.
Right. And we'll see the Fed regain its independence in part two. But important to keep in mind that the dual mandate is in the late 70s, right? Or mid to late 70s. So it's outside the scope of this study, right? Yeah, so we have we have the Federal Reserve with no actual express mandate. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Yep. And so if you go back to White, so at this point, White is this expert on all the key issues. So this leads Morgenthau in December of 1941 to direct White to start thinking about something he calls the Allied Stabilization Fund, which might provide the basis for kind of a post-war international monetary order. And by the way, Morgenthau later tells Truman that his intent all along with this was to shift the center of the world from London and New York to the U.S. Treasury and to basically make the U.S. dollar the basic unit of exchange for the world. But I think it's a little bit revisionist because he was really influenced by Harry White this whole time, because that's exactly what Harry White's plan is at this point as it starts coming to shape. And so the kind of basic strokes, the broad strokes of Harry White's plan is, number one, the US dollar should be at the center, backed by gold, but the US dollar should be at the center of the world. There should be a fund that helps countries stabilize their currencies if they get into trouble, which of course becomes the IMF. But at this point, that doesn't exist. And this kind of concept, this architecture, should try to grease the wheels of free trade, basically prevent currency manipulation and trade barriers and things like that. He basically wants rules and institutions that prevent what ended up happening, all the chaos of the 20s and the 30s. And I think the undertone of some of this too is assurances for the losers of World War II that they won't be wrecked like they were in World War I, and capital for reconstruction, because Europe is going to finish World War II completely devastated. And so that's in general what Harry White wants. The contrast to this plan is John Maynard Keynes, who at the same time in 1941 is thinking similar thoughts. It's like, how do we come out of the War II with a much better economic system? And, he's been writing about all these things and trying to redesign the idea of economics. And so, of course, he dives into this and he comes up with a few ideas. On the one hand, he also wants to stabilize kind of the global economy and grow trade. So very similar to the White plan. He wants to discourage the tensions of the 20s and the 30s, but he's a bit more interested in balanced trade than Harry White is. And rightly so, because Britain at this time is not the exports powerhouse with a massive trade surplus that the U.S. is. I mean, the U.S. in a sense was the equivalent of China today. The U.S. was like the manufacturing engine of the world. And so the Keynes plan proposes something called Bancor, which is a play on the word for bank and gold in French. And this Bancor would be basically international money, international currency that would be managed by a global central bank, so this kind of supranational institution. And basically you would have a fixed exchange rate with every other currency in the world and with gold, but this Bancor currency would not be redeemable for gold. Basically, the way it would work is that if you are exporting, you are earning Bancor. In order to import, you basically use Bancor to settle any trade deficits. And there are mechanisms by which you might incur penalties if your surplus is too large or your deficit is too large. And the intent is for this to create some kind of, automatic regulating mechanism with an oversight body that can help kind of tweak manually as needed, but to kind of create balanced trade across the world.
One thing I thought was really interesting as I learned about Keynes's plan was that the Bank of International Settlements would have been the perfect entity for him to express that through, right? That's the bank of it existed at the time. I think it'd been around for a while. But it was people spent this time actually trying to put the Bank of International Settlements out of business because of how it had helped finance the German stuff, right? So I thought that was really interesting.
Actually.
Yeah. There was a lot of time spent at Bretton Woods trying to shut the Bank of International Settlements down because of how they were on the German side during World War II. But when you think about who was the natural existing player for managing Bancor at the time, it was the Bank of International Settlements. But they were never even part of the conversation.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah. I wonder if there's anything else in that story. I know that Keynes, one of the interesting things about this is that Keynes wants to be the designer of the new world order. Like, he definitely wants to be recognized, his legacy to be that he designed, he sort of architected this new international monetary system. And that ends up coming up later as a big kind of critical decision point. But that feels like something else that might have driven them to go away from it.
Yeah, and Keynes, there's no question that Keynes is the most famous economist of all time, right?
Yep.
And I'm trying to think, people at least say that John Maynard Keynes invented macroeconomics, right? I don't know if that's just something people say, but I think there's an argument that he did.
Yeah.
And so the idea that this guy is living during this time and that he may not be the author of the next global monetary system is kind of wild, right? Because he's kind of the very clear global thought leader.
Yeah. He's like the Isaac Newton or something. He like invented economics almost as we think about it in terms, at least macroeconomics. He would be a great person to have on the show if he were still alive. Be a perfect guest. Okay, so the stage is set, and the way that Ben Steele describes it again in his book, which I thought was really good, he basically says that the stage was now set for the two plans to confront each other. On the battlefield of intellectual flair, the Keynes plan would surely triumph, but they would engage on terrain decidedly more favorable to White, as it was his nation that held the gold, and the only reliable vouchers for gold, U.S. dollars. So the golden rule playing out. The U.S. holds 2/3 of gold reserves at this point. They're in the driver's seat. And so at this point in 1942, and really over the next 2 years, right, so through 44, right before Bretton Woods, White and Keynes kind of fight it out. And they're having a really hard time, despite agreeing on like 90% of kind of the thing that they're trying to architect. They have small differences that actually make a massive impact on the outcome of how this might evolve. And so it's interesting because if you think about how they interacted, right? So there's on the one hand Keynes and his like abrasive style. There's a quote that he has, which is he calls the White plan, quote, difficult to understand and almost impossible to read. It would seem quite unworkable in practice. One sees how inadequate it is to solve the real problem. So terrible diplomat.
Great accent.
You're welcome. And then Harry White, on the other hand, his associates apparently mentioned that he would get sick before these meetings. I mean, I can only imagine, right? Like if you're just this guy, I mean, obviously a powerful guy, a guy that represents the government at a very senior level, but you're not even close to John Maynard Keynes, right? And you're going to go and confront this person who's brilliant and this world-renowned, economist. And so he would get like physically sick before all these meetings. And there's another scene that's kind of fun to think about to kind of highlight the dynamic between them. At one point, apparently, Keynes goes a little off the rails and he makes this like weird Jewish reference. And the quote is something like Keynes says, "This is intolerable. It is yet another Talmud. We had better simply break off negotiations." And apparently the response from Harry White, which is awesome and very witty, he was like, "We will try to produce something which your highness can understand," which I think is like a really solid response. I think by this point, yeah, they've interacted enough where it's like, I'm not scared anymore. You pedantic person.
Why do you think the U.S. had so much leverage over the U.K. at this point? Like, what would you pin it?
I think, yeah, I mean, my take on this is maybe twofold. On the one hand, they have all the gold, but on the other hand, the UK economy is wrecked from the war, and if you go back, basically there had been negotiations for the U.S. to help finance the war in as neutral a way as possible. So there's a concept called cash and carry that they kind of institute at the beginning of the war, where basically the U.S. says, okay, if you can pay in cash for any supplies that you want to buy, and this is to any country, right, like including Germany and the Axis powers, if you can pay in cash and you can supply your own basically ships to carry it back to wherever you needed, then we'll sell it to you. And of course, the intent of this, like this is specifically designed for Britain to be the only one to be able to do this. It's the only one that has the cash to potentially pay for this, only one that can control the shipping lanes in the Atlantic. But that kind of runs into a wall when Britain starts running out of cash. So I think that's kind of number one. And then there's Lend-Lease, which, I mean, do you want to go into that a little bit? I think you studied that quite a bit.
Yeah, so that was going to be my answer to what is the one thing that gave the U.S. so much leverage as we kind of headed into this conference. Although I think the point you're making is an important one that I didn't fully appreciate, is that cash and carry came before and resulted in Lend-Lease, right? Like as the UK ran out of cash, they needed Lend-Lease.
Yep.
And so Lend-Lease was basically the economies of the world that were fighting in World War II. They retooled their entire economy to fight in the war, and or a lot of their industrial facilities were destroyed during the war. And so there came a point towards the end, kind of in the back half, where the UK couldn't afford to fight the war anymore, right? And so they turned to the US and they basically said, if you don't help us out here, then the Nazis are coming to you next, right? France has already surrendered. They're attacking us now. Once they take us, they're coming to you. And so they worked out this deal called Lend-Lease that was basically a way for the U.S. to supply. The U.S. built up this huge industrial base which ended up benefiting it hugely after that in terms of being, the producer of the world on terms of consumer goods and whatnot. But it built up this huge industrial base to supply the UK with tanks and planes and ammunition and all that stuff. And they had all these different agreements for like what had to be given back, how it had to be given back. And it was all either lending arrangements or lease arrangements. And remember, the entire economy of the UK is built up around the war right now. And so Lend-Lease is programmed to stop as soon as the war stops.
Right.
And so the war actually ended much earlier than was anticipated when they agreed on Lend-Lease. And so coming into these conferences, the UK knew that its economy was toast without Lend-Lease, right? They knew that they needed some kind of loan in the short term to kind of bridge the gap between Lend-Lease going away and the war ending, whatever came next. And that without that loan, we're just kind of headed right back into a Great Depression. The US is even more powerful. And so I think to me that was like the main thing. The UK essentially had no cards. Like I think I read at one point that their only alternative to whatever the US proposed was just going back to the barter system, which probably would have made the US even more powerful than Bretton Woods did.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is one alternative, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But before that, I think let's talk a little bit about the build up to Bretton Woods, to the conference itself. And so, after 2 years of back and forth between the British and the Americans, there's commentary in the press, by the way. This isn't something that's highly confident. I mean, it's pretty confidential, but there's things that are leaking out. And so the press is highly critical or even praising certain aspects of this. But they go back and forth for 2 years, and they're finally ready for a conference in June of 1944, which, as you might remember, Matt, it's like the turning point of the war, right? Because June 6th is D-Day, and sometime later in that month, the Americans kind of take over the center of Rome, and then the Red Army is making a lot of gains on the Eastern Front. And so the war really is moving at this point clearly in the Allies' favor. In late June, the British come to Atlantic City in the U.S. to meet for some like pre-draft sessions and kind of pre-negotiations. And then in July, they end up taking the train up to New Hampshire to meet with like 700 plus delegates from 44 different countries in the beautiful woods of New Hampshire in the summer to kind of hammer all this out. And immediately you kind of have the stakes set up, which is, you can, the press kind of, and the public, but the press in particular, immediately starts attacking the American delegation for basically facing off against like the best, most famous British economists, including John Maynard Keynes. The Chicago Tribune have a headline that says, "The Englishman who rules America." And they say something like, "He overshadowed all other figures at the conference." And what's really interesting is to think about it from White's perspective, right? He can't compete with the celebrity status of a John Maynard Keynes. But that's not really the game he's playing, is it? He's kind of, it's not public opinion that they need. It's the delegates. It's kind of the support of the delegates at this conference. And so the debates get going. The Soviets are slow playing this whole thing. They are there. They're participating, but they're slow playing everything. Everyone at the conference is jockeying for, preferential treatment and these quotas that have to do with how much, they can borrow from these different funds that are being discussed that might get set up. And this is where that alternative comes into play for Britain, right? Because they need the financing that might come from Bretton Woods. Otherwise, they're not going to survive, and the economy is going to be a disaster, another Great Depression after the war. But New York bankers actually hate the idea of this stabilization fund, what becomes the IMF. And they actually go to the British delegation confidentially, and they're like, "Hey, we don't like this. It's competing with our businesses, right? Like currency exchange and international lending are huge profitable businesses for New York banks." And they basically offer a loan on pretty good terms to the British, to which Keynes kind of reacts in disgust and says no. And this is back to the point of a little bit of ego and legacy, is that Keynes is very focused on trying to architect the system that will go on to be the New World Order. And he doesn't want an alternative, even though this is all debatable, but even though that could have been a much better deal for the British than signing on to Bretton Woods potentially.
Right. And I think that also goes back to Keynes's kind of idealistic personality, right? Like I think thinking that you can coordinate the global economy from a conference in Bretton Woods for the rest of time is quite idealistic.
Well, and in that way, him and White are very similar, right? They both have that. In a sense, well, we'll see. I'll make an argument here on the espionage thing that has to do with that. But back to Bretton Woods, delegates are kind of confused and frustrated. Can you imagine like a conference, 700 people trying to negotiate like the global monetary system over a couple of weeks? So these guys aren't sleeping, working a ton. There's a couple of quotes from Ben Steele's book that's like, somebody says to Harry White that this is like the most chaotic mess in the world, and the delegates are all going crazy. And the British say something like, the administration here is incredibly bad. It's wild.
And I thought one of the interesting things too was not so there were 44 countries there, right?
Yep.
There were groups there that didn't speak English.
Right.
The Russian delegates couldn't make any independent decisions. The Russian delegates
had to
couldn't
write
make
home.
any,
right. For everything.
We're talking, where are we in the technology of communications at this point, right? I think we're in the time of cabling.
Yeah, there's cables, but they're very slow, right? Even the cables are very slow.
Right.
Couple of
we're
days.
Talking, a couple of days just to make basic decisions. And we're also in the boonies of New Hampshire, right?
Yeah.
Where I think there's a whole story about why the conference was there. It was something about how the senator of New Hampshire, FDR knew he needed his vote for something.
Exactly. Yeah, to approve all this stuff.
Right. So like you've got nationalities from all over the world descending on the middle of nowhere, New Hampshire. The people don't even know that the Allies are really pulling ahead at this point.
Exactly.
And there's a funny story. Funny might not be the right word, but of how the Chinese delegation, went out for a hike, and they ended up getting in like a very violent altercation with the locals because they thought they were invading Japanese. And so that's kind of the scene that we're in here. It's pretty raucous.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, to sort of quote the British again, they're like, not only is this a mess, the committees are wasting a great deal of time. So they think this is like a disaster, that nothing's going to come of it. But in a sense, like this is all by design, right? Like I think Harry White actually wanted the committees to waste time. And he kind of structured the whole conference the way that this is divided up into different committees, considering different issues and who he has leading the committees. In particular, he has Keynes leading the committee of the World Bank, which I think Keynes wanted to because it's this like reconstruction capital and all this stuff. And Harry White himself, is leading the Stabilization Fund Committee, which is the one discussing how currencies will work, once this new monetary system is in place. And as an example of all of this, like I think the kind of climax of this conference for White is that at one point, someone in the Stabilization Fund Commission wants a bit of clarity on this kind of ambiguous term. Gold convertible currency is what they call it in the agreements at this point. And it's pretty ambiguous. Nobody knows what a gold convertible currency is or which currency might be convertible. And one of the British delegates actually suggests that should just say gold and US dollars for clarity. It should just be that. And in his mind, I think it makes sense because at that time, the US dollar was the main currency convertible to gold. European countries are a mess. They don't have cash. The currencies are all kind of a disaster. But of course, White, this is exactly what he wants, and he jumps on it. Kind of, he basically says, yeah, great, let's do that. And let's move on to the next issue. And so before anybody even has any chance to react, not that a lot of people in the room really understood the long-term implications of what this change might mean, the concept of gold and US dollars ends up being baked into these agreements. And like famously, this is a conference that's taking place really fast. Everybody's working really hard. Most people don't read the whole thing before they sign on the dotted line of the agreement saying, we're all agreeing to this. And so he kind of sneaks this into the agreements. US dollars are convertible into gold at $35 an ounce, and all other currencies are convertible into dollars at a predetermined fixed exchange rate with room for like plus or minus 1% in terms of revaluation of a currency. And then there's a mechanism by which a country can revalue its currency, in a bigger range with the approval of the IMF if necessary. other countries, except Britain, of course, for whom the pound is basically getting replaced by the dollar as the currency support in world trade. But other countries are fine with it because the U.S. has most of the world's reserves, right? It's the world's economic powerhouse by then, and tying every currency to gold directly was unstable. Better to have the dollar as a way to kind of attenuate potential crises and help stabilize the system. And of course, everyone, White in particular, anticipated that the U.S. economy would keep chugging along with huge manufacturing output and trade surpluses and prudent fiscal and monetary policy. And by July 22nd, the last day of the conference, everybody signs. Keynes praises everybody, including the press, which I found kind of funny. And Morgenthau says something to the effect that what they had accomplished there was more significant than what was actually embodied in the final documents, which I think, for him, it means this concept of like international cooperation and this architecture of this new world order that should lead the world in a much better direction going forward. And so they all sign, they celebrate, they go back to their countries. And Bretton Woods basically starts moving forward to ratification. It's a bit tricky, but by July 1945, it gets ratified by the U.S. Congress. By December of 1945, it gets ratified by the UK Parliament. So, and White and Keynes are actually pretty instrumental in navigating the politics and getting the politicians across the finish line.
And they were ratified with very high margins, right? By both the US and the UK. Yeah, huge approval.
Thanks to the senator from Bretton Woods. Yeah. And so
that's right. That's what he was needed for. Yep.
Yeah. Got to play the politics. And so a year later, they end up meeting all these, not everybody, but most of these delegates end up meeting again in Savannah, Georgia. And they're there to basically operationalize the IMF and the World Bank and the whole Bretton Woods system. And there's a lot of tense negotiations during those meetings. And sadly, Keynes has a series of heart attacks. And he actually has another heart attack as a few weeks after he comes back home to the UK in 1946, and he dies at the age of 62. Harry White, similarly, who you might recall, right, from the beginning of the episode, from the opening, that he is summoned in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1948 for allegations of spying. He delivers his passionate testimony. He goes back and forth with the congressmen, including Nixon. And after he finishes, he has a heart attack also. And he had another heart attack when he got home, and he dies 2 days later at 55. So
I did not appreciate that. So all of Henry Dexter's life was really packed into 40 to 55, and he left a mark.
Yeah, exactly. And not just that, but like the mirror, like the contrast between Keynes and White, and they both sacrificed themselves at the altar of architecting the system, and it kind of killed them in a way, right? So a bit of a tragic ending for both of those guys. This is where maybe I have a question. We can kind of come full circle, and I'm curious what your take on Harry White is, and kind of his extracurricular activities, as a potential spy for the Soviets.
A couple thoughts. So first of all, the Bretton Woods Conference was before the Cold War started, right? There's not an official date for when the Cold War started because it was a Cold War, right? No shots were fired there in the beginning. But most would pin the start date to something like Churchill's Iron Curtain speech or George Kennan's Long Telegram. And both of those were in 1946, right? So the Bretton Woods Conference ends in mid-1944. I think the timing of Bretton Woods itself is interesting in this regard, right? Because Russia was there in a big way, right? Not only were they present and contributing, but everybody at the end, signed a document that said, we're in. And so Russia signed on to be one of the largest stakeholders and capitalizers of the IMF and the World Bank. But then when everybody went home to get formal approval from their governments, the Russian government actually did not ratify the agreement and therefore did not join the IMF or the World Bank or this new system because they thought it gave the dollar too much influence. And so clearly, even at the Bretton Woods conference itself, we're at sort of this precipice of the relationship between the U.S. and Russia. But the thing that probably resonated with me the most as I studied it, in terms of where I shake out on Harry Dexter White, is I probably am pretty close to where his wife was. It sounded like his wife was named Ann Terry White, and they had 2 daughters. She was not a communist. She did not approve of his espionage activities, and I read that she actually made him promise to stop. Right, which kind of made me laugh. Right, that makes for like a very funny marriage dynamic, where Ann Terry White's waiting up late at night. And Harry Dexter White comes in at 1 a.m, and Ann Terry's like, "Harry, you promised you would stop being a national leader spying for Russia all the time. You've got to stop spying for Russia, Harry. You need to get help, Harry. Stop spying for Russia." Just feel like those must have been very interesting conversations. So in terms of where I shake out on him, right? Like I don't think he changed that the U.S. I think the U.S. was going to be the unilateral leader of the world after World War II, no matter what, just given the circumstances. I think it's really good that we didn't withdraw like we did after World War One. But I don't really give Harry Dexter White credit for that, right? It seems like that was inevitable. That was going to happen anyway, just given how strongly how strongly Bretton Woods was approved in Congress afterwards. It was pretty much unanimous. And I think Harry Dexter White had probably convinced himself that he was doing something patriotic by being a Russian spy, that he was forming some kind of helpful alliance, right? It seemed like he was America first and Russia second. But he knew he was a spy, right? He wasn't like questioning whether he was a spy. This guy knew that he was a spy for Russia. And that's never going to be okay, right? Like you never can be a spy for another country and get a thumbs up from me. So I'm a thumbs down on Harry Dexter White. I think he was probably an economic genius. I don't think he really changed anything in terms of how it would have played out anyway. And he was a spy for Russia.
Yeah, I think there's not a whole lot of daylight, I think, between your conclusion and mine. Maybe a tiny bit of nuance. I don't think he was a communist or like a Stalinist, like a nefarious Soviet spy. I generally agree that like he was basically trying to navigate towards a world where 2 powerful countries, the Soviet Union and the U.S., would be able to collaborate, and we wouldn't get into these tensions that led to World War II. I think he was a techno-optimist. Really ambitious guy, hungry for relevance. Definitely. I think that probably drove a little bit of that engagement. And I think he genuinely believed that he was right. And I also think that, everything that he accomplished at Bretton Woods would sort of signal that he's definitely batting for the U.S. However, is it okay to have done what he did? Probably not, right? I think his engagement with the Soviets and his engagement in Soviet espionage activities is clearly not okay in my book. And there are other channels, to sort of try to do that. And so that I think that's where I land on him.
Yeah, I guess a key question on him is, did he know he was a spy?
Oh, he definitely did.
And yeah, he did know he was a spy. So that's a good point.
He definitely did.
That's not there's no way that is, not treason.
Yeah, exactly. Well, to bring the story home, the Bretton Woods story home, in theory, Bretton Woods was established in 1945, but really in practice, it doesn't really get operationalized until about 1958, when most European countries actually returned to convertibility for their currencies. And this is mainly because, European economies were devastated, and the Marshall Plan helps, but it takes about a decade to really start seeing significant recovery for Europe. And even then, Bretton Woods was stretched to the breaking point almost from the beginning. At first, there's a dollar shortage in Europe. There's not enough dollars to go around. And then later, there's a glut of dollars, relative to the gold reserves backing them in the U.S. And I think the key flaw in Harry White's plan here is that the system kind of has a tendency to want more and more dollars, and convertibility into gold reserves almost guarantees that the U.S. will have less gold backing that increase in dollars over time, and it'll put pressure in the dollar. And so it'll be so much pressure, actually, that JFK famously told some of his aides that the only problems that kept him up at night were nuclear weapons and the balance of payments deficit, basically the gold outflow from the US and the pressure on the dollar, which is pretty significant to think about, right? Because we don't remember that. We typically talk about like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War and all the nuclear stuff, and we don't really talk a lot about all the problems that there were and like the amount of tension there was with gold outflows and the dollar, during that time period, which is what we're going to talk about in part 2, which is exactly that period.
Awesome.
Anyway, there's 3 questions that are like super interesting discussion topics for this. One is, do you think that floating rates would be possible today without first having gone through the Bretton Woods system that established the dollar as the reserve currency? Right, that's one question that I was thinking about as I was studying this. The other one, because I think it's path dependent, but that's a debate. Another one is, what would White and Keynes think of today's international monetary system? Because in a lot of ways, it's like the exact opposite of everything that they envisioned. And then the other one is China today in a similar position that the U.S. was in 1945? Which I think that probably is a little bit of a less controversial question, but it's super interesting, coming out of this to think about.
Yeah, and I think, on that note of China versus U.S., right, like one of my big takeaways here is, people talk about the global monetary system and the system's fragile and the system's going to collapse and the system's going to change. And to me, this, the Bretton Woods conference highlights to me like what it really takes to reset a global economic system, right? Which is just 2 horrific wars that like wipe out millions and millions of people and destroy a number of countries. They have no ability to produce anything for, several years after the war. And so it really just takes an enormous global body blow to reset, whatever the economic system is at the moment.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I think people talk about the Mar-a-Lago Accords as if it could be a new Bretton Woods, but I think, it should be like somewhere in the middle ground between China and the US, maybe Hawaii. Hawaii, it's like almost right in the middle. It would be a fantastic place to go. Okay, let's leave it there. Good.
All
right. Thanks, everybody. If you enjoyed this, the best way to help us is to share this with anyone that you think might like it, and to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, tune in for part 2 of the series next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.